And without further ado,
let's do this.
Welcome to this week's episode of the Readout Loud, a weekly biotech podcast from STAT. I'm Allison DeAngelis.
I'm Adam Feuerstein.
And I'm Elaine Chen.
It is Tuesday, January 14th, and we are here live in San Francisco for the JP Morgan Healthcare Conference. This is a special taping of our podcast. We are live from San Francisco. Audience members, can we hear some noise?
Thousands of people are here.
That was beautifully on cue. But before we, tamp down the excitement a little bit or, try to keep it stoked, here's what we're going to talk about this week.
Yeah, it's a special episode of the podcast, so we have a very special guest, Eli Lilly CEO Dave Ricks.
And of course, the latest news, gossip, and baking developments here in San Francisco.
All that after a word from our sponsor.
So please help us introduce a man who probably needs very little introduction. Eli Lilly CEO Dave Ricks, please come join us on the stage.
This is just like Joe Rogan.
It feels just like
relax.
Yeah.
We'll do 3 hours of ivermectin talk right now, okay?
I think I need to be somewhere else.
All right, great. All right, so we're going to kick it off. So I guess we'll use that Dave Ricks intro. That'll be the intro that we just used. So we don't have to introduce him again, right?
Absolutely,
okay.
Yeah.
So Dave, we wanted to start off the interview today, and first of all, welcome to the podcast.
Great to be here.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We want to help you maybe settle a long simmering debate that we have had at STAT about, is it pronounced GLP-1 or GLP-1?
Well, we say incretins. So
Dave, that's not helpful.
No, but because there's like a super family of these proteins that signal your body from your gut. And we know a lot about GLP-1, that's how I would say it. Because
I'm so disappointed.
It's 3 separate words. We don't say like PIDL-1 for PDL-1, do we? So GLP-1, yeah.
I'm being pummeled here, I'm being run over.
But there's others too, like amylin, GIP, so there'll be more drugs in this category. So
I'm sticking with Team GLP-1.
Adam
okay.
is wrong again. Okay, let's get straight into the news this morning. We got Lilly's new guidance this morning.
Yeah.
So now Lilly expects that for the fourth quarter of 2024, $13.5 billion in sales. That fell a little bit short of expectations, and that was driven by lower than expected sales of Mounjaro and Zepbound. And this comes after we also got quarter 3 sales that also disappointed. So can you explain what's going on here? I think what we hear about everywhere is that there's overwhelming demand for GLP-1s, but now for 2 quarters in a row, sales have not met expectations. What explains this disconnect?
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. No, we rolled that out this morning because I think we also were a little surprised at the end. We have to remember, just to step back, we're in pretty early days here. We're just lapping year 1 for Zepbound. And a lot of things are happening that we haven't seen at this scale or growth rate before. So the forecasters have a hard time. Just to give you a sense, like our current GLP-1 or incretin business is annualizing in Q4 at $25 billion a year and growing 60%. So we've never seen a medicine launch like this, and predicting what are kind of small assumptions, but on that scale it tend to be turning up in hundreds of millions of dollars of miss or hit, has been difficult. That said, no apologies, we own it. It's our job to give reasonable guidance to the street and then try to hit that, and we earnestly were trying to do that. Q3 different from Q1. We saw great demand in Q3, and the markets performed as we thought. What we didn't expect was about an $800 million destocking from wholesalers and retailers. We say, whoa, that's weird. Was that because you couldn't supply them? It's actually the reverse. So we really corrected the supply issues in the first half of the year in Q3, and they have every incentive to draw down working capital and carry as little inventory as they possibly can, and that's what they did. We didn't predict that, but that's what happened. And then that continued actually in Q4. So that's part of the miss, is we exited the year for the first time in my career with 0 inventory build in December. Usually over the holidays, they pad the stock a little bit. That didn't happen at all. And we could talk if you want about pharmacy economics and wholesaler economics, but they're not good on these drugs. And so they, I think, are seeing this as something they have to do, not something they want to do. We've rebased our assumptions. We're not planning on stocking going forward. We also saw, not in the weight loss category, but in the diabetes side, a bit of a slowdown in December. And we can guess on this or get into the policy debate, but usually December is a pretty good kick up over October, November. And often in chronic disease, we've thought of that as because people either schedule in a lot of medical things at the end of the year to use up while they're on the deductible's been burned through. And now we've restructured Part D, and that's a little bit different because in 2025, there is no deductible phase really for Part D beneficiaries. So maybe that affected it, or maybe you do see in particular the other drug in diabetes, Ozempic, really flat in the fourth quarter. And maybe some of that, people choosing that medicine for non-diabetes uses is going over to the obesity market, and they're just flattening because they're kind of the brand name. We don't know why, but it happened. And it happened late, so we couldn't predict it, and we missed. That said, underlying 2024, phenomenal year. Original first-time guide was $41 billion. We ended up at 45 on the year, and we're growing 45% in Q4. And I don't know any company our size in this sector or many others growing at that rate.
So I wanted to just flip over to talk about the guidance for 2025, Dave. $58 to $61 billion in revenue for 2025. Consensus was around $58 billion, I think. Yep. So you're well above consensus. Given what you just said, talk about a little bit about what's baked into that guidance, and it seems like there's a re-acceleration of growth for the obesity drug.
It's actually 32% growth, and that's pretty similar to what we did on the whole year for 24. Q4, as I mentioned, was 45. So it's pretty consistent growth, I'd say, and that's a reasonable thing. Of course, we want to meet or beat that guidance, but we did roll forward the new things we learned in this new market in Q4, low stocking. We assume that for the whole year. We don't plan on our distributors or retailers stocking much of our product, sort of filling on demand. And we did assume a lower baseline for the diabetes side, but the obesity side is growing pretty aggressively. And now there's new markets like obstructive sleep apnea, which we're just launching into. So that's all in there. Important to note as well, the GLP-1 or incretin business at Lilly.
I'm going to get you to be a GLP-1 guy by the end of this podcast.
Maybe by the end, yeah. Maybe I will. I don't know. So the non-business incretin business, which is a little less than half of the company, grew last year by high teens, and it's a $20 billion annualizing business. So the other thing from an investment standpoint is I don't think there's any drug company that doesn't have a GLP-1 that can say that. So our goal is to actually grow both these things, and that's a strong contributor in 2025. New launches, we expect our oral SERD to launch, some other cancer medications, new indications for Omvo and Crohn's. So a lot of growth happening on both sides of the business. And we have two other tailwinds in the year on the incretin business. One is new global launches. So we just introduced in China in December. Plan on introduction in Brazil mid-year. These are enormous markets with lots of people who need obesity medications. Really, the competitor hasn't launched really in earnest in those places either. So kind of green field territory to grow our incretin franchise. And then, as I mentioned, new indications, obstructive sleep apnea, just promoting this week. Expect new access and insurance, and that's a key thing in the United States to come online with that. As well as later this year, planning on HFpEF for the congestive heart failure use from the medication. And just on a side note, we've worked hard this year to prove out in big clinical studies that you don't just lose weight, but there are profound chronic health benefits to losing that weight, and those are two examples.
So I'm wondering, can we talk a little bit about, the supply and demand of these medicines? And you mentioned, a broad competition and what we've potentially, what we have seen and what we haven't seen. But let's talk about right here in the U.S. with the introduction of compounded medicines and how that's played into, Lilly's business and the launch of these drugs. Is compounding, how much is it affecting demand in today's day and age, realistically?
I don't think anyone really knows the answer to that question, and it's hard to know in a world where, for most of the year, at least us, I think Novo too, weren't really operating with extra stock on hand, right? So everything we made, within a couple of days, we shipped to customers and people consumed. So in that world, if we didn't have compounding, I think we'd just have more frustrated customers. Now, that started changing Q3. We came off the shortage list because we ended up setting a goal to have at least 2 weeks of stock, and we pulled back our demand-generating activities so that fewer people are asking their doctor and more people were just getting scripts filled. I think that was a responsible and important thing to do for customer satisfaction and success and fulfillment, and we have a little buffer now. So is it affecting us? Maybe a little bit. I think there's two categories of consumers going to compounding. The largest one, I suspect, are not on our label,
What do you mean by not on your label?
meaning their BMIs are not over 27.
Oh, okay.
And so there you have a question. Maybe that's where they can get access to the medication to lose weight, but it's not medical weight loss. That's not something we'd be pursuing anyway, so I don't see that as competing with us. Now, I don't think most forms of compounding is very safe. I certainly would never do it or recommend it to anyone I know, but people are doing that, and it's a kind of a consumer, like med spa, Botox clinic kind of phenomena. The other side are, I think, people who have real cost pressures. They need obesity medication or diabetes, and they have bad insurance that's not covering it, and so they have to pay out of pocket. We have out-of-pocket offerings, $399 entry point, et cetera, but even that's too high. So there are people doing that, and that's the piece we need to work a lot harder to increase coverage, and then at the same time police this quasi-industry, because what they're selling is not the real thing. It's not close. And we know that because we test it ourselves and we get adverse event reports. People are harming themselves, and that should stop.
Yeah, we had wanted to ask, I think, Elaine, you had a question along these
Yeah,
lines.
so, on that point, a lot of the patients I talk to have turned to compounding because of these cost pressures.
Yeah.
And I know Lilly has introduced vials, though a lot of the patients I talk to still find them pretty cost prohibitive, and the vials are only offered at the lowest doses. So a lot of the patients ask me, like, if Lilly's goal is really to offer safe and accessible medications for versions of these GLP-1 drugs, why not offer the full range of doses in the vials and at lower prices to try to stave off these concerns about compounding being unsafe?
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't rule that out. I think, first of all, we have various manufacturing and supply capacity issues. Secondly, there is so what we're taking advantage of there is a little bit of a wrinkle in the U.S. Pricing market, and this is a good stat deep dive topic of why do drug prices work the way they do? But one of the peculiarities is there's rules that government beneficiaries get the best price in the country, and if you sell that to one entity, then every state gets that price. So there's enormous disincentive for manufacturers actually to lower facial prices because of this. Additionally, we sell to PBMs, and they want to have that rebate capture themselves. So this whole thing irritates them substantially, and we have conflicts over that in terms of whether they'll go with just one manufacturer, not two, and so forth. So we have to navigate all that terrain. It's not as simple as you're describing, but we want to get there. And we can navigate this now because we have an alternate form, the vial, and under peculiarity of the government pricing rules, that doesn't force us to lower price for all federal beneficiaries, but it does affect that PBM and the mainline business. So we're working we'd like to lower the entry cost, and we'd like to have more doses available. That's not something we're announcing today, but we see that as an option. And about 1 in 3, maybe 1 in 4 patients using Zepbound are self-paying. So it's a meaningful category. That said, the main thing we can do, the most effective thing we can do, is get broader coverage. Most Americans, all but 14 million, have insurance, and that insurance should cover obesity as a chronic disease. That's our core medical belief. By the way, the doctors agree with that. That's in the AMA guidelines. The FDA agrees with that. Who doesn't agree with that? Employers and insurance companies and the federal government. So now the Biden administration is making a very important proposal to change that rule, which recategorizes obesity as a chronic condition and covered under Part D. That will have an enormous downstream effect positively on patients in commercial insurance and ACA plans. So we're hoping that gets finalized. That's the ultimate answer, because then we don't have to do these sort of gimmicks to get around a pretty difficult system. But we're empathetic to that, and we want to work on that problem.
That proposal that you mentioned, proposed by Biden in the last days of his administration, it has to be finalized by the Trump administration.
Yes.
There have been reports that you've been talking with the Trump team. What's your sense so far of where they're leaning on that? Are they, how open are they to getting CMS to have to cover obesity medications?
I mean, I think that remains to be seen. They're not in office yet. I mean, on Tuesday morning, we'll wake up and begin to get real answers. I think the conversations are encouraging for a couple reasons. One, take him for what he is, RFK, ran on this platform of making America healthy again, and I take him at his word. Here, I think we have really significant common cause. I mean, we've got 45,000 employees. That's what we want to do. We want to make America healthy again. So it starts with that, and of course, like diet and exercise, and he could use this platform for tremendous good in that regard, and there's a lot of overlap with what we have. But the science tells us, and there's a lot of literature last year that proved this, both in humans and in other models, that once people carry excess body weight, your body defends that aggressively as a survival instinct. And diet and exercise really doesn't work. In our big studies, we put people on rigorous calorie restriction and diet counseling, and after a year and a half, on average, people lose 2% of their body weight. By the way, on our drug, they lose 22%. So it's not close. And once you've become overweight, getting to a healthy body weight is extremely difficult for biologic reasons. So we need medicines. Those two ideas can live together. And so that's our pitch. And by the way, if you're worried about government efficiency and Medicare solvency, one of the most meaningful things that can be done at scale is actually using obesity medications in America. It's often pointed out that our life expectancy is poor compared to European countries, et cetera, and there's really only 3 reasons for that. 2 of them are a little bit an artifice of how the life expectancy works in terms of the calculation, which is gun violence and opioid deaths. We'd like to work on one of those, opioid deaths, but we can come back to that in this conversation. Yeah. Gun violence, I don't know if incretins will affect that. But obesity is the third, and that actually is a lifelong impairment on life expectancy, and we can address that. I think this is a tractable problem now, and we just need to scale it. So that's what we'll say to the new administration.
So sticking with Trump, obviously said, inauguration is coming up. It seems like ever since the election, we've seen this sort of parade of top business leaders, executives, going down to Mar-a-Lago, having dinner with Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago. You had a dinner like that. I don't know if there's anything you can tell us about that dinner, but I'm wondering, it seems like there's a little bit of sort of a bend the knee kind of thing going on here, and I wondered if, is this something that you guys have done, that CEOs have done with other presidents? It just seems like there's maybe there's more, it's higher profile now, but I wonder what your sense of, like why these visits and what you're getting out of them, and then, just overall what your thoughts are about the upcoming Trump administration.
Yeah. Well, I think Stat reported that dinner happening, and so it's on the record. Albert and I went with Steve Ubel from the Pharma Association. Yeah, to engage. I think there's nothing unusual about engaging with an incoming administration. In fact, in my career, we've done it many, many times. The one we didn't do it with was the Biden administration. Part of that was because COVID was going on.
Sure. Yeah.
But also maybe some other reasons, to be honest. I think they were tough to get access to for all industries. So that's normal. I think what's a little different here is that the setting is different. Normally you're like in an office building in Washington, like the Republican headquarters or something, and here you're not.
So you're saying Mar-a-Lago is a nice place to visit?
You're at a country club owned by the president. It's a little odd, right? So, but no, it's a nice setting, fine, and that doesn't actually matter on substance, but it has a different look to it. The other thing is I think that President Trump, as we know, he likes to be around business leaders. I think he sees himself as one. He respects that as sort of people who earn their way to the top, and he likes to talk to us. So that's good for business. I think that there's a value in that, because I think what we've seen in the last several years has been relatively isolated regulation from regulated, and that produces bad outcomes, I think. Of course, we want independence, but I think crosstalk is important. We could talk about stuff that happened under the Biden administration, but I think some of it is well-placed but bad implementation because of this. And I think the likelihood of getting that under Trump 2.0 is lower, actually. We might get other things that are untoward, but talking about the issues and finding common ground and doing things that are practical and can work quickly is what they're interested in, and we're interested in that too.
Before we talk a little bit more about what this new administration means, I wanted to just follow up on something that Bloomberg reported yesterday, that Eli Lilly is formally asking the Trump administration to pause IRA negotiations. That's not something that you pursued under Biden, and unlike some of your peers, Eli Lilly didn't sue to stop that. You didn't pursue any sort of legal action. What's behind the change in tenor?
Well, we weren't subject to the first round of negotiations. We didn't have a drug selected. So we didn't really have standing to sue or do anything like that. We might hypothesize we might be part of this next round, but also we now have the case because we've watched what they've done. And here I'm not talking about, there's several versions of this, like we don't like the IRA. One is like repeal it. That's not what I'm talking about here, although we'd be happy if they did. There's other fix it legislatively. That's different. That's more about the small molecule rules, which we don't like at all. I think it's really warping capital allocation in our sector, and particularly in biotech, in a way that's non-productive. We'd like to have that fixed. This is really about how it's implemented as written. And there's lots of rulemaking and procedures that are promulgated by HHS when these things happen, and they're out there. They're very muddled and confusing, and I think inoperable, actually. And it's not just about getting to the price. It's like how you effectuate that in the market when it comes due. And we're going to see that in January 26. And so our advocacy with the incoming administration is you have another round to do yourself. But before you do that, look at what's going to happen and be on your watch January 6th, or January of 26, not January 6th. That's a different date. January 1st of 26. And it could be a mess as it currently is constructed. And I can go into that if you want. So I think it's time to pause and say, if we're going to have drug pricing, let's at least have it work for patients. And I'm worried that it won't. So that's why we're asking for that.
What do you think his...
By the way, it's reported Lilly it's actually the industry is doing this. Pharma is doing this. So.
Really? Okay, that's a formal coming from pharma.
Yeah.
Okay. What is your sense of what, kind of response you might get, given that I think, in retrospect, a lot of us can say it's not very, you don't really have to look into a crystal ball to say that the economy and costs for the average American consumer really drove this last election.
Yes.
Do you think that he is amenable to repealing the IRA?
Probably not for our reason, to be honest. I think fixing is more tractable, but that's probably more in the detail in Congress, which is about the 9 to 13 rule and when the government intervenes. And just to diverge on that a little bit, here I'm talking about when the government can negotiate and really truncating the effective return life of a new asset. And that's already baked into all the VC models and our own models. And you're already seeing more capital go into biologics than small molecule projects. And that's a really stupid thing long-term, because the cheapest and most effective thing, most efficient thing in healthcare is a generic small molecule. When they go generic, they become dirt cheap. Like we made Prozac. It costs 4 cents a day in the United States, and it's the leading standard of care for depression still. That's a great deal for America. That was our invention, but if you look over a 30-year timeline, it's really effective. We don't want less of those, we want more of those. That should be rewarded, right? Instead, it's being punished. So that we need to fix. But I think, I'm sure that the people at HHS and in the White House don't want a mess in 2026 that they didn't invent. And I'm sure they would like any savings generated by the government to be effectuated down to the consumer. For the reason you're saying, is people are price sensitive. We all want out-of-pocket costs to come down. What we argue about is who should pay for that. And IRA has a position on that, which is the industry should pay for that. That can happen, but there'll be less R&D in the future as a result of it. That's a fact, but that's what we've said to that. We think insurance should pay for more of it. Why? Because you're preventing other insurable benefits, and it's a short-term, long-term trade-off. They would like to charge more premiums if you do that. Now, policymakers don't like that. So where do you squeeze the balloon? That's the debate that we're having. We do know one thing, and I think have good agreement with the incoming administration on this, is that we should try to make the pathway from medicine producer to fulfilled prescription much more efficient. Right now, that value capture is too high for the value created, and that needs to change. So we agree on that, and hopefully we'll get some action there, both on PBM reform and even on distribution efficiency.
Novo Nordisk's semaglutide is widely expected to be in this next round of negotiations, assuming that happens. How do you anticipate that affecting the pricing and dynamics for Mounjaro and Zepbound?
Right. Good question. That's part of related to your question, because as it's confusing today how exactly that would benefit patients. Right now, the way the savings have been constructed is all the benefits go to the Treasury, right? And then the company's supposed to effectuate that price into a transaction they're not party to, right? There's a Part D plan provider providing the insured benefit, there's a consumer out of pocket, and there's a pharmacist. We're not there. So how does that occur? Although they say we're supposed to do that. I don't think it's reasonable to have each manufacturer for every drug sign a deal with the 300 Part D sponsors to like figure out how to do that one by one. That's I think a bad idea. What seems to me is like a more efficient thing would be say, okay, if you're negotiated, use like the $35 insulin cap, because I'm intimately involved in that and help create that. Why don't you just say you have a capped out of pocket if you're a negotiated drug? That would then immediately drive down prices, people would see it. That's not what they've done. So that's an example of the kind of changes we'd like to see. But if semaglutide is negotiated as it exists today, like what would I predict would happen? I would predict that there'll be a little bit of chaos in terms of what people actually pay that will frustrate people. That Part D plan sponsors, assuming we still have rebates, will disfavor semaglutide because there won't be rebates. Basically, the government's taking the rebate flow and directing it to the Treasury. And then, by the way, the Biden administration said, now we're going to go back cross-subsidize out of the Treasury premiums. So you've taken what rebates have done historically, which is the sick subsidize the well in Part D. That's what they are. And now you have the government in the middle of that transaction, basically taking the money and handing it back. So I think these are all the problems with what the IRA implementation has been. Yeah, they get a political win saying we took $6 billion out of these companies. Okay, but they just wrote a check back to United Healthcare for the same amount. So what has happened here? I think much better to work on that efficiency argument. Why don't we have no rebates? Why don't we have common list prices so that cost sharing can be based on a real price, not a fake price? How about we look at cleaning up the IP rules so that we don't have forever products that after 13 years or whatever, we all agree that we get generics and biosimilars. I'd rather work on those things with the incoming administration. I think that's a much better way to sustain innovation and drive down costs.
But just to, clarify, for Eli Lilly's business, if your biggest competitor in the incretin space, if that price gets negotiated down for a significant portion of the population, does that not inherently put pressure on how you price tirzepatide products, on the potential of your customers moving over to the cheaper option of semaglutide?
So it depends on how it's done. And today, what I'm telling you is, under these rules, I would predict if nothing changes, Novo will not change the list price of semaglutide. What they'll do is write a check to the federal government every quarter. Now, how do patients benefit from that? Yeah, I don't either. And if I'm a Part D plan provider, then what am I going to do? I used to get that same check, almost the same amount, by the way. That's kind of what's happened in this negotiation round. Government's not good at a lot of things, and apparently negotiating drugs is another one we can put on that list. Then they don't have the rebate flow to subsidize premiums. They're going to disfavor that product. That's what happens with rebates.
So then, isn't that good for you then?
Yeah.
Oh.
That's an upside for us under the current rules. But we're running a business over the next 100 years. I don't think we want to operate in a market with these big dysfunctions. They won't last. People get frustrated. It's early. Why don't we just get the rule right? If we're going to have negotiation, let's at least have it benefit patients.
Maybe I'm a much more selfish person at the end of the day, because I would say, hey, that's a boon for me.
Yeah. We've operated for a long time as a company. You see these things come around, and almost every wrinkle that gets taken advantage of in healthcare eventually boils up into a major problem. So I'd rather just avoid that and have more transparency. Why don't we have, just lower list prices and people can make formulary decisions on that? I think it's a better world.
Dave, you mentioned, President Trump, obviously, someone who's very pro-business, certainly pro-American business.
Yeah.
But then you've got groups within sort of the Trump world, RFK, the MAHA world, who have criticized obesity drugs.
Yep.
They've criticized pharma.
Yep.
There's an anti-pharma bent to it. how do you reconcile those two? Like, that seems like a push and pull within Trump world. Like, I don't know. This is not a question, but like, what do you think about that?
I think it's a big question, Adam. You're hitting on. I mean, if you just step back, putting aside health for a second, I mean, there's a lot of these in the Trump administration that's coming in beyond. Like, just take the government efficiency versus economic growth. Right now, if we removed the deficit spending we have, we would be at 0 GDP growth. So that's unwinding that quickly will have a big economic impact. If they want to cut out $2 trillion in spending, that's going to show up immediately. Just like when they put $2 trillion in COVID, it showed up immediately. Maybe it's the right thing to do long term, but I think that's a very politically difficult thing. Cutting taxes, of course, business likes that, but that drives deficits. So those things seem to be very much in opposition, and so do tariffs and immigration, right? No doubt there's problems with the immigration system. We'd be for a good sit down on that as a business community. But one of the reasons why we are outperforming Europe is we have immigration in terms of economic growth. Those jobs and economic activity is an engine of growth in our country. And then, tariffs, that's definitely anti-growth. But Trump seems to like it.
I assume you're courting more of you'd like to see more of the Trump pro-business side than the
naturally.
Maha anti-pharma
Well,
side.
yeah, the Maha anti-pharma, I think, let's see. I think that there is common cause, as I mentioned, with this idea of making America healthy. If that's really the goal. If the real goal is like plaintiffs, attorneys wanting to sue drug companies for vaccine liability, we have no interest in that, and we'll fight tooth and nail on that. I think if that happens, we won't see any new vaccines for a long time. And that's a terrible outcome for our country and the planet. So, and I don't make vaccines. I take them, but I don't make them. So, we'll have to see which flavor shows up and how it shows up in different things. Administrations are complex organisms. What I was saying and relating to is, like at the top, there's a prioritization that has to occur. And it has not yet occurred because it was about winning with a broad coalition, not governing with priorities. And I think that shows up first, not in the rhetoric, but in the legislative agenda. And they're having a debate about one bill or two and which things are in the bill. That will tell you what they really care about.
In the interactions that you've had so far, what's your sense of, where the priorities might fall? As Adam was alluding to, we have quite a few disparate voices with regards to even just, opinions on obesity drugs coming into this new administration. I mean, certainly I would imagine you went down to Mar-a-Lago to get a better sense of, trying to predict where the legislative agenda might fall. What's your sense today?
Yeah, I mean, we didn't get into deep substance. It was more about like creating the contacts and beginning the discussion, particularly if you have confirmed appointees, you got to be careful with that process. Yeah. But I think it's an interesting coalition of people. I mean, for instance, of course, Kennedy we've talked about, but I think, Mehmet Oz is an interesting character running CMS, and that's actually the most important job in HHS. And, he practiced medicine and was a TV personality, but I think he's interested in using that platform for driving a real, prevention agenda. And of course, that would be good for weight loss medications and theoretically good for vaccines. I mean, these are the kinds of medicines that prevent chronic disease. He's passionate about that and has spent his life talking about it. So it'll be interesting to see where the priorities settle. FDA, I think the critique there is often on lack of transparency, and there's these closed-door meetings. I actually think it's in our interest as an industry to promote more transparency at the FDA. There aren't that many regulated industries that are saying, yeah, I want a stronger regulator. That's a weird thing. I think what we want is a more consistent and transparent regulator. It's good for us, too. And that's something they could achieve. And if Marty wants to work on that, we'll work with them. If we want to tear it down, that's a disaster, right? I think the FDA was built for a reason, back to compounding. That's the reason, actually, is people who want to make money on the back of health claims with illegitimate product. Yeah. That's what compounding is, by the way. And that was going on at scale 100 years ago, and so we got the FDA. It's a better world now. We just need to refine it. And I think transparency could go a long way. And I bet RFK and his team would say, yeah, let's start there. Well, let's see what was said. Let's see what was written. Fine.
Yeah, you've already said that you plan to defend the FDA. In your position, how exactly do you do that?
I know, it is a little bit odd, as I said, like there aren't many industries like clamoring for better regulation. But I think one thing is the people. So this is an institution that is filled with scientists who I think work for a lot less than they could make in industry. And they do it for a reason. They do it because they're purpose-driven. They want to make a difference in Americans' health. And mostly they do it pretty well. So I think anything that would chase a lot of people out of the FDA would be tactically terrible for us, because those are the people actually pushing the paper and reviewing the data and approving things. And if we had like no approvals for 2 years, that's a big problem for the industry. But also, I think I really believe in what drove them to where they are. And we can disagree on things, but respect the scientific process. That mostly works well. What's bad about the FDA? I think transparency could be enhanced. I think the communication sometimes is poor. And it's, like a lot of government things, kind of bureaucratic. And when you get that, you get inconsistency and slowness. So we'd like to work on that problem as well. And if they have energy for that, we'll work with them.
Yeah, I was going to say on the FDA front, like in terms of, because what I hear from CEOs, and biotech companies particularly, that they are concerned that especially early in clinical development, the process gets bogged down.
Yep.
There's a lot of oversight, there's back and forth, and it costs a lot of money, whether they have to go and do extra animal tox studies. The cost of those studies add up millions and millions of dollars. Is that something that you'd like to see the FDA sort of streamline and maybe sort of be
There's a difference
little bit more
between where the
efficient?
bar is and making sure it's consistent. That's more what I'm saying, versus changing the bar. And maybe in some diseases, there's like patient advocates, you guys talk to who really advocate for that. Like when we have nothing, something is useful. And dialing that, and like a lot of things in government, once they get put in place, they're hard to undo. A refresh of that might be warranted, calibrating to the state of science and technology. That could be good. But in general, we're for a high bar. And by the way, there's a huge knock-on effect in the rest of the world. The FDA is still the only regulator who does primary data review. No one else on the planet does it. You're trusting industry. So that's an odd thing about the RFK narrative is actually, they're the only independent reviewer out there. If we didn't have that, who else is looking at this data? Now, I think, the Mercks, Lillys of the world, like we try to do a good job. Sometimes we make mistakes in our data and they find them. That's fine. There are occasionally small companies who need to be checked. And
Oh, trust me, I write a lot about
that
them.
role. I know.
That's Adam's whole career.
They play that role, yeah. I read your Twitter feed. And so, and if they don't do it in the US, think of there's lots of companies outside the US that would really try to exploit that. And I think that could harm Americans. But overall, it's due for a tune-up, and we'd be up for that.
I want to switch topics here.
Yeah.
It seemed like you were alluding to perhaps what I'm thinking about, but at the Economic Club a while ago, recently, you talked about how you're now going to study obesity drugs in addiction.
Yes.
And that's really interesting to me because it's not, financially not the most, lucrative field. Its reimbursement's not great for addiction drugs. Tell me why you're getting into this space, and what kind of studies are you planning?
So the short answer is because that's what Lilly's for. Mm-hmm. I think when we look at these, a lot of discussion and sell-side analysts talk about market size and pricing. I find that a little bit of a very short-term thing. Let me give you an example. Obesity drugs. So we launched the first GLP-1 inhibitor called exenatide, or Byetta, in 2006, first one in the world. And on the cover of our annual report, there's a picture of a lady who's taking for diabetes and saying, I lose weight, I know I'm losing weight, and everyone tells me I look great. And we had teams inside our company, I was part of that narrative, say, okay, everybody sees this, let's increase the dose and study for obesity. And the leaders of the company there listened to that too much. When you just step back and say, what is the cost, the human cost, the economic cost, the downstream effects of this, it's the single biggest thing we could do in all of healthcare in developed world. And are we going to listen to a market study about pricing to tell us to do that or not? I think that's backwards. So if you have a breakthrough innovation that changes life expectancy, go for it. That's ours. And this is a large population. It's worth doing at scale, and Lilly's for scale. So we don't really weight that very much. We'll figure that stuff out. I think what we want to see is does giving one of our medications, and we have a whole portfolio of these, so we can pick one that's not tirzepatide, for instance. That way we can manage side effects, and there's issues like, in people who don't need to lose weight, but you can dial down the desire complex in the brain. Can you get one without the other? So we have ideas about this, but first we need to do the proof of concept and prove it out. Can we make a medicine for this that could be highly effective? And highly effective, I mean, like what we've been doing with tirzepatide. So we treat people with MASH, and 50% of them after a year don't have MASH at all. That's an effective drug. I'm not worried about MASH pricing. I think people will pay for that when it comes. Same with opioids. So, that's not in our calculus. I think we should do important things, and the commercial downstream will work itself out. By the way, it changes all the time anyway, so predicting it 7 years out is kind of a useless exercise.
I do, on that train of thought, I have to ask, because we've entered this era of, obesity drug development where it's the, everybody trying to edge each other out in terms of, I've got 21% weight loss, I've got 23%, I've got 28. How much is enough weight loss? And is that, you're talking about like kind of being mission driven in a sense, is getting, additional 2% of weight loss really, that game changing for patient outcomes, and, why is that a priority?
Yeah,
Besides being the best.
It's a really important question, actually. And the main reason is getting to a healthy body weight. So when we give these mean weight loss, the distribution curve is quite wide. So like the total tirzepatide database, like 1 or 2% of people don't lose any weight. 98% do, but some only lose 5%. Some lose 10, some lose 20, some lose 50%. So if your BMI is 45 and you're morbidly obese, and you lose the average amount on tirzepatide, which is about 25% over a longer term study, you're still obese. And we know that living that way through life is not healthy. If you don't have a chronic disease yet, you'll have one. So getting to goal, which right now medicine defines as BMI of 25 if you live in the United States, will take more on average. That said, for some people, tirzepatide could get them there. People have lost. I get, one of the joys of my job is people send me flat mail still, and I read it. And often there's 2 pictures that come to me now, before, after. And some people are like, there was a woman who wrote me the other day who was like 410 pounds. Now she's like 180 pounds. She was on 16 medications. Now she's on 1, Mounjaro. And that's a super responder. This is good enough for her. We're going to change her life expectancy. But for some people, they don't have that kind of response. We need more. By the way, we also maybe need less for some. So maintenance, what's that, right?
Yeah.
And we know that in our environment, we tend to eat calorie-dense foods and things that have been engineered to make us want more, et cetera. So how do you combat that modern food environment? There's a maintenance need as well. That may be modest weight loss, but very convenient, cheap, easy to take. That's another profile.
The way you talked about kind of your reasons for why you're going into addiction, for example, is interesting in terms of you're not so hyper-focused on short-term financial incentives. And I feel like this is a kind of position and maybe kind of luxury that Lilly is in now because you have all this
Maybe so, yeah.
all this revenue.
Yeah.
So can you tell us more broadly, like with all of this revenue you have from the GLP-1 drugs, like what are your priorities and how you're investing it? What are your top priorities going forward?
Yeah, there's really 3. Well, first is, of course, we're in a moment still, and it's not done yet, right? It may be priced in, but we need to maximize the impact of tirzepatide and the next 2 obesity drugs, so orforglipron, the oral project, which is very important for scale, and retatrutide, the triple-acting, super high weight loss drug, because that's what's in front of us. It's pretty probable. If we do that well, we'll end up the leader in this category, and we can make a massive impact on human health and do really well economically. So that's clear. That's about manufacturing build-out, all these trials we're doing for these different uses, et cetera. The second one is then really maximizing the other part of Lilly, the less than 50% growing at mid-teens, oncology, immunology, neuroscience, and doing important work there that may never be the scale of what we're talking about here, but the people with those conditions don't care. Those are good businesses to be in. It's probably longer term and more repeatable, And there may be a day we hope to find better and better weight loss drugs, but the cycle in our industry, sometimes it's 15 years long, sometimes 40, but at some point you run out of ideas that improve on the next thing, and you have to beat a generic, which is basically free. So that will happen in weight loss, and we need to have a company then. Our company was founded 149 years ago, and I'm not going to be the guy who drove it into the rocks. So that's an important mission. The third thing is this white space thing I think you're getting at, which is what can we do now? Because we don't really believe in scaled M&A. Our goal isn't just to be bigger per se, and those are messy, a lot of problems with those kinds of ideas. But could we do big things, maybe a portfolio of risk, that others would not be willing to do because they're long and hard, but likely? And so that's a kind of R&D project we're drawn to. We have a couple going now. So one is we have two medicines for this new kind of bad cholesterol, Lp(a). It's not new, but we have a way to address it. And it's thought that this could be 30% of residual heart attack and stroke. And we're doing those long, hard studies that are primary prevention. The others are doing secondary. So that's a big idea. That's millions of people saving lives at the planetary level. Alzheimer's prevention is another. So that's a hard study to do, but if we could find people who have amyloid but no symptoms and are aware they're at high risk of getting Alzheimer's and treat them and they never get it, that's a game changer for the health system and for those people's lives. So we want more of those things as our third piece, and that's sort of where the surplus will go in our thinking.
So, Dave, last question. I'm sure you're happy about that.
It's been a pleasure to be with you.
I want to ask you about the trillion. It's a $1 trillion question, and that is, there's been a lot of talk about Eli Lilly becoming the first healthcare company with a $1 trillion market valuation. We're here in San Francisco, and there's a bunch of tech companies that have multiple $1 trillion valuations. No healthcare company has ever achieved that kind of size. Is that something that is important to you, important to Eli Lilly?
Not per se. Obviously, it's exciting to employees and investors when the stock goes up. But I see that as a pretty derivative outcome of doing the things we just talked about well. And there is no valuable company without valuable products. We're a product company. We need to make valuable medicines. The thing in our industry that has gotten in the way, because there's lots of companies that made hugely important medicines, ours, others, that I'm sure have been on the stage, but it's hard to do it in a cycle time where you don't have a contraction cycle, right? You create something big, and then you're up against the clock all the time. We have about a 12 or 13-year life. By the way, the cycle time in our industry for developing a drug is 12 or 13 years. So the day you launch, you need your next idea already. And that's been a hard thing. We are attacking that problem. I think you can, to get to that, let's just say you had $50 per share of earnings, and the average multiple right now in our industry is 13. So that's a $650 million company, right? So that's like our size now, with a lot more earnings. The reason we're worth a lot is there's a belief in future growth, and you have to have both. You have to be big and be able to grow in a repeatable way. We think about that at the meta level as well, and we've worked hard on execution clinically in particular. So our time from IND to approval is now 6 years. It's the fastest in the industry as we can measure it. We think we can get it to 5. That's more medicines faster. But now you can start to innovate inside your patent cycle, which I think is sort of the age-old problem in the sector. Probably if we do that and we focus that engine on important spaces, white spaces that are uncovered and can scale, we could get to that kind of valuation. We've got one, need to repeat it.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that does it. We have to say goodbye to Dave Ricks. Please join me in thanking him for joining us here.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so we are officially, about a day and a half into the JP Morgan conference. Already a fair amount of news flow so far, including some M&A deals. Adam, what's your take on what we've been seeing out of the conference so far?
Yeah, so, obviously going into the conference, and we talked about this on our last podcast, was M&A, like the big question about M&A, and will we have M&A, have takeover deals at JPM? There's always been a lot of obsession about the need for M&A and the lack of M&A in 2024. So yes, Sunday, we all saw like the Bloomberg story that came out that said that Johnson & Johnson was going to buy Intracellular Therapies, which is a maker of neuroscience, schizophrenia, and depression drug, for $14.6 billion. That deal, and then they announced the deal on Monday. So that was like, wow. So here we go. It's the largest deal done in biotech since 2023. So sizable deal, 14, almost $15 billion. So I think, from that perspective, positive. What's interesting to me is that there hasn't been a lot of follow through. That's a big deal. We had a couple other smaller ones, but like from a stock perspective, stocks broadly dropped Monday. They were actually before we started recording today, they're down again today.
Yeah.
So we're probably not necessarily seeing a boost in sentiment overall yet.
We've gotten kind of disappointing guidance sales numbers. Like we just talked about Lilly, their stock was down pretty significantly this morning. Moderna, Regeneron, I think it's a mixed bag where, there's M&A news, but it's still weighed down by all these misses.
And on the startup side, a continued drumbeat of reprioritizations, layoffs. It still feels like so much of the industry is settling after a tumultuous couple of years. And so you mentioned, Adam, the Intracellular acquisition. We had two other smaller acquisitions, a $1 billion and $2.5 billion deal, I believe. And that, I feel like, highlighted the trend that we started seeing last year. And I anticipate, from what I'm hearing around the conference, will continue this year, which is that pharma companies are much more interested in kind of smaller deals and private companies.
Yeah, the two other deals were private. They were private companies that were acquired. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're a publicly held biotech in today's day and age, 2025 maybe wasn't the best kickoff for you.
And I think part of the problem is, there's this issue with, this question of, are there too many biotech companies out there?
That's an age-old question, Adam.
In the public side, I think there are too many public biotech companies. And so there needs to be consolidation, and one way you consolidate is M&A. But we're seeing, every time I see another IPO announced, I groan, because I'm like, oh my God, here comes another company. I can't keep track of all the biotech companies that are out there, and now here are more that I might need to keep track of. So I think, I guess I would say that, if you ask, what's the mood? Because that's a thing we like to talk about, right? The mood. I would say it's a mixed bag right now.
Elaine, what would you say about the mood?
What do you think?
Yeah, I think I feel the same way. Well, I was actually going to ask you, Allison, because I know you were at a lot of VC parties last night. Tell us the mood from those.
Yeah,
Allison goes to the parties. She's our party person.
And Adam and I are.
I'm in bed by
homebodies.
9:30. Yeah.
I might have gotten home after midnight last night. Yeah, I think it's, generally good. People are happy to see each other, but there is a little bit of underlying anxiety that I've been feeling among the startup sector, in part because, this year has kicked off, and last week we had 4 deals announced that were big, $100 million plus rounds of initial investing, and they were for assets that were licensed from China, which has been kind of a growing trend over the last year and seems to have kind of solidly taken hold. And so in the startup sector in the US, I am just talking to a lot of folks about what does this mean for us? And what does this mean for what biotech startups look like in the years to come? And that's a question that I don't know that we have a really solid answer to at this point. Otherwise, I've heard a lot of gossip at the parties. I'm thinking, I would love to get the audience's reaction. I'm thinking of starting a biotech blind item, like a blind gossip column.
Oh, I like that. I like that idea.
Thank you. I don't have a name for it yet, so anybody who wants to suggest something, just come find me afterwards. But I want to hear, Elaine, you were in what I heard was one of the hottest tickets on town. You were, one, in the Westin over the last couple of days, and then 2 had popped over to NVIDIA, which I heard was standing room only, you would shove your grandmother, down on the sidewalk to get in that front door.
Yeah, what was the NVIDIA party like?
It was interesting. I think just the fact that they held this huge event on the Monday night of JPM was pretty significant. I think it just goes to show how much more kind of enmeshed the healthcare and tech industries are now. We had Jensen Huang, the CEO of NVIDIA, speaking, bringing multiple healthcare CEOs on stage one by one.
And didn't he have reminded me of like a David Letterman desk?
That was
setup.
exactly what his goal was.
It's
So-
speaking and drinking.
Yes,
apparently.
so it started with red wine, then they moved to whiskey. So it was him drinking with these other CEOs on stage. I mean, just like talking about the various ways that they're using AI from the sequencing all the way into kind of more drug discovery and then into like actual implementation with hospitals, which was interesting. I think we were talking about this, like there's still quite a lot of hype around the potential of AI in healthcare. And I mean, like the industry seemed really interested, at least the NVIDIA CEO said there were 400 companies kind of represented at the event in presence. So, yeah.
400 companies represented, but then I was like hearing around town, both from their presentation at the conference and then, in the hours since their party, a lot of people commenting that there wasn't a lot of substance to it all. It was a lot of...
It was a lot of just talking
flash.
it up. Right. It was. Yeah, there wasn't it was just talking about the potential of it, but it's kind of like, when are we going to see the actual results?
Well, I mean, that's the age-old question of like AI and drug development.
And the other thing we should mention, I think that was striking to me, was the bomb-sniffing dogs
Right.
outside of the West End, where
barricades.
and the metal barricades around it. I mean, there was obviously in the aftermath of the killing of Brian Thompson, the United Health Group, the executive, there was a clearly heightened security presence here in San Francisco. Like I said, I've been, this is my 21st JPM. I've never seen a bomb-sniffing dog outside of the West End, and there were this week.
Maybe you should train Bo.
The dog's really
And
cute. I
bring
got to
him
say,
next year.
I was very tempted to go pet, because they look like they're black labs or black lab mixes. They were very cute, and I did want to go pet them, but I know that they were working and it was a serious thing, so I didn't do that. But I did have that urge, I have to say.
I feel like I'm now going to be waiting for the next like
Bo would
30
not make a good bomb-sniffing dog.
I'm just going to be waiting now for the next like 36 hours to see if you get arrested for trying to pet a
No,
bomb-sniffing
I'm
dog
gonna-
outside of the West
I'm
End.
going to not do that.
Oh, goodness. Okay, I think we should call it there. Everyone, that does it for another episode of the Read Out Loud.
Thank you to Teresa Gaffney for producing this week's episode.
Our senior producer is Alyssa Ambrose, our executive producer is Rick Burke, and our theme music is by Brian Joel.
We would love to hear from you. Tell us what you like about this week's episode, what you didn't like, and what you think that my blind item should be called. You can do all that by sending us an email at readoutloud@statnews.com.
And if you like what we do, leave a review or rating on Apple Podcasts or whichever platform you use to get your podcasts.
See you next week.
And that's it. Thank you all.